Welcome to Mindshift. I'm Brandon. Today should be a pretty interesting video. I'm excited to talk about the Pharisees. This is a group that I think doesn't really get understood by the modern Christian. All the modern Christian knows is that the Pharisees were the enemy of Jesus. In fact, it's a great insult for Christians to give to people they don't agree with scripturally, which is why I have been called a Pharisee so many times. But I wonder, were the Pharisees really in the wrong? Did they have an improper expectation of the Hebrew scriptures or what the Messianic king would look like, and thus their disapproval of Jesus to fit this role? Were they being stubborn and hypocritical and snotty and self-righteous, or were they following closely the word of God and acting in the way that they saw God act and move in the Old Testament, which was in direct conflict, mind you, with how Jesus was acting? These are some of the things that I hope to cover, and here's a pretty quick agenda, then we're going to dive right in. One, I just want to talk about the different Jewish sects. I think it's important to understand definitely the Pharisees for this, but also more about the Sadducees, the Essenes, and the Zealots. We're going to be doing some comparing and contrasting between these groups so you can really understand their role in the first century as these events transpired. Second, and pretty quickly, we're going to talk about the modern Christian perspective on the Pharisees. What is it? Why do they have it? Where are they getting it from? Etc. Third, we're going to look at the scriptural tension, is what I will call it, between Jesus and the Pharisees in the accounts that we get from the Gospels. And last is some kind of a finale. We're going to look at the expectation that the Pharisees would have had for the Messianic king. What were they? Also, what were they not? And why then did it lead them to believe that Jesus was not fitting the mold? This is essentially the difference between Judaism and Christianity, but I think that we can thread out some nuance within it, and I'm excited to share it with you today. This is all happening because we just covered Matthew in my secular Bible study series. Also, you may have noticed that I have started the previous 2 days with some mini mind shifts. I'll just say it one time here so you know what they are. They are 5-minute or less clips. They are not new. This is me taking segments from my previous videos and just putting it out there as additional content for people with shorter attention spans, or that maybe didn't make it to the end of a video, or to hopefully attract some new audience, etc. So if you want to engage with it, wonderful, thank you. If you're like, hey, I'm a diehard, I've already seen it for sure, and you want to skip it, that's totally fine, but it is something I'm going to start doing. But without further ado, let's dive into point one and talk about these 4 different Jewish sects. And again, there are more than these 4, so we're generalizing a little bit here, but I think that's okay. Let's talk about the Pharisees first. The Pharisees play a really interesting role in Jewish history. First of all, they're kind of the progressives of their time. You'll see that as we compare them with the Sadducees. They're open to oral Torah instead of just written Torah, interpreting the law, letting the law evolve, using it to understand that there are things that aren't covered in the law that would come up in daily life, and you might have to be a little bit more fluid with your understanding and interpretation. But on the other hand, they were also quite conservative, as they wanted to keep the Jewish way of life, especially in lieu of the Hellenistic period that was coming in. This really started after the Maccabean revolt in like 160 BCE. And these Pharisees were simply against that getting in the way of typical Jewish life, as well as the high priesthood. So they were great interpreters of the law. They knew their stuff, and they had a ton of influence over the common people. Also, funny enough, considering that Jesus, who is going to be a dying and resurrecting figure here, is someone they were going to be against, they were one of the few groups that believed in resurrection, a concept not universally recognized in Judaism at that time. And lastly here, and this is just a high-level overview, we'll do the other 3 sects and then we'll come back. But lastly, they brought in a purity culture, and not in the same way that you think of 90s purity culture here in America, but they wanted to take the rituals and the purity aspect of temple life and apply it to the common people in daily situations. This was one way to fight back against the Hellenistic lifestyles that were coming in, and also kind of shield the Jewish people from those influences. I think they're a fascinating group of people, and you can really understand at least their motives and justifications. This is essentially where we get rabbinic Judaism today. Also, without groups like this, scribing away, making copies, upholding the law, making sure that we don't lose it, would there even be a foundation for Christianity to evolve off of? Feels kind of like Christians who don't like the concept of the Pharisees are biting the hand that feeds. But let's move on and talk about the Sadducees. Now, unlike the Pharisees, the Sadducees are coming mainly from the priesthood, from the ranks of the aristocracy. They too emerged from these same socio-political aspects that brought about the Pharisees in the first place, but they rejected the oral Torah, and they focused primarily primarily on the literal interpretation of the written word. Also, they did not believe in the resurrection of the dead, nor in angels or spirits or demons. To them, everything was still revolving around the temple and the sacrificial cult. And so when the temple went away in 70 CE, pretty much so did the Sadducees. Now, kind of an offshoot here are the Essenes. They were a mystic cult at the time that was separate. They were all about communal living, communal meals, ritual bathing, some of them celibacy. They are often associated with the Dead Sea Scrolls, which suggest a deep eschatological and apocalyptic vision. And again, unlike the Pharisees and Sadducees, they lived away from the urban communities, practicing a form of asceticism that was opposing the materialism or corruption of the temple guild. And then you have the Zealots. The Zealots were a group that emerged in the Roman occupation, a revolutionary group that sought to actually overthrow Roman rule for Jewish law. These were, strictly speaking, nationalist, opposed to paying taxes to Rome and wanting to institute a hierarchy, a government that focused on loyalty to God first. They are best known for their activity during the First Jewish-Roman War, which led to the siege and destruction of Jerusalem, and that happened in 66 through 70 CE, culminating in that final destruction of the temple in 70 CE. So hopefully all of that is helpful. Again, at this time, the Jewish people, they liked the Pharisees. The Pharisees were sticking up for them. You had foreign rule coming in, adopting new ways, changing things, getting rid of tradition. And the Pharisees want to keep the specialness and distinctiveness of the Jewish people and Jewish religious practices. That was their aim. And again, they were there to help people. They were the legal experts. They were the ones who understood the law. They helped with unique situations. They worked as judges. They created community. This bringing the priestly rituals down to the common people united the people. It gave them daily expression and worship to their God. Also, considering I don't like the old law or the God of the Old Testament's character, it's not something I'm happy about defending, but from a traditional understanding of this religion and its history, they were in the right within that mindset. Jesus was the outlier, and Christians are going to say rah rah. So let's just move right into point 2 with the Christian perception of the Pharisees, that the Pharisees were these hypocrites, these brood of vipers, as Jesus calls them, that do these holy things just for the praise and attention of the people. And fair enough, I'm sure many of them did. I love Jesus's take of the spirit of the law versus the law itself. But let me ask you, from if you've paid attention to my last 39 episodes of Secular Bible Study series, which one do you think Yahweh falls on? Is he wanting people to honor the spirit of the law or the letter of the law? The letter of the law. There's no doubt about it, and we will get into some examples. So again, even though Jesus's version sounds prettier, it is simply contradictory in nature to the God of the Old Testament. So what's so funny to me is when you hear Christians today praise Jesus for bringing the correct insight and understanding to these rule followers, these literalists, these people without the Spirit of God on them. I ask you how they were any different than any patriarch in the Old Testament, than any prophet or king that was doing as God bid them to do to the letter of the law, or else facing extreme consequence. Something that comes to mind right now is Saul, who tried to follow the spirit of the law. God had commanded Saul to go and utterly destroy every single man, woman, child, and beast. And Saul did that. He killed women and children, along with every soldier, but he left a few livestock alive. And why did he do it? He left them alive so that he could sacrifice them later to the Lord. That to me seems like a spirit of the law. Like, yep, we wiped them out per your request of genocide, Lord. But I took it upon myself to save some of them to make an extra special offering to you. Nope, God said that is not what I ordered. How dare you? And it was at that time that he removed his spirit and blessing from Saul and began to prepare David. I could give you a billion examples like this from the Old Testament that prove God cared about the letter of the law. There was no spirit of the law when he struck the man dead for picking up sticks on the Sabbath. It was the letter of the law, and the punishment was death. Period. And as a former Christian, again, I completely get it. We are brought up in this mindset of Christianity already being true and Jesus being the Son of God who came to correct the misunderstanding of the Pharisees, of the common people who were lost. God sent Jesus to help them get found, to show them the correct way. And it's a beautiful respinning of the story. But again, from an objective point of view, from a secular point of view, Jesus is thinking radically different, completely outside of the religion, and completely contrary to the very God he claims to be the son of. So if you're a Christian watching this, I know that it's so hard to see that. The story as it has been presented to you, the reason you are a Christian and not a Jew, is because you see Jesus as the correct fulfillment of God's original intentions instead of the counteract to God's original intentions and character that he clearly is when you pay careful attention to the scriptures. I'm also not advocating for Judaism. I don't believe any of this is true. I'm just trying to give some historical and accurate perspective to what was going on at this time and what these religions say that they believe and the source material that is provided for it. With that said, let's go ahead and move into point 3, where we're going to talk about the scriptural tension between Jesus and the Pharisees. And we've already kind of laid some of the foundation for this here. I gave you 2 examples quickly about the man who was struck dead by God for picking up sticks on the Sabbath, as well as Saul, who lost his entire reign for not following the letter of the law. I could give you a bunch more examples. In fact, we just covered some in a previous video. Aaron's sons utilizing the wrong kind of fire during the ceremony, and thus both being killed immediately. Uzzah, who catches the ark. What better spirit of the law is there than someone who has so much reverence for the holy object that they try to catch it when it's falling? That wasn't good enough for God. God got angry at Uzzah, it says, and he killed him. This is the God the Pharisees are reading about, a God that is beyond strict, where death is the most common punishment. And so to contrast that, let's give an example from Matthew 12, 1 through 8, where Jesus and his followers are rebuked by the Pharisees for eating grain as they stroll through the field on the Sabbath. And Jesus gives a really strange defense here. He quotes 1 Samuel 21, 1 through 6, where David eats consecrated bread. It's not an apples to apples comparison, though. Let me read you what actually takes place. David is speaking with a priest, by the way, and he says, "Now then, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread, or whatever you can find." But the priest answered David, "I don't have any ordinary bread on hand. However, there is some consecrated bread here, provided the men have kept themselves from women." So this doesn't have anything to do with something taking place on the Sabbath, but it does have to do with following purity laws. And David's response here is also important. David replied, "Indeed, women have been kept from us, as usual, whenever I set out. The men's bodies are holy, even on missions that are not holy. How much more so today?" So the priest gave him the consecrated bread. So again, Christians who don't take the time to read this just think, oh, Jesus is so smart, he's so wise, he's always got a good comeback, he's so funny, he's so sarcastic, we love Jesus. But he's comparing a story where the priest who had the authority allowed the consecrated bread to be eaten because David did indeed keep the rules by keeping his men ritually clean and free of women. Jesus ends this diatribe where he's chastising the Pharisees back by saying in verse 8 from Matthew 12, "For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." So he is stating his authority over traditional Sabbath laws. Well, if you're just going to say you're better than the Sabbath laws because you're of a higher authority, why even give the David example in the first place? So sure, it seems like the high priest made an exception, but only after making sure that David's men had followed the rules, whereas Jesus's followers are just openly breaking the rules with no authority. They're not on any special mission. They don't need an exception. They're not starving to death. This, of course, would have seemed completely improper to the Pharisees. And to them, who is this Jesus? What right does he have to call himself this? Why would they even believe this? In fact, the Old Testament scriptures tell them to be weary of people like Jesus, false prophets who will come and even be able to do signs and wonders. Miracles that Jesus would later perform don't show anything of his divinity. The devil can do that. Demons can do that. The devil will dress up as an angel of light and do signs and wonders. And again, many false prophets will come and do these things. So tell me where the Pharisees have gone wrong and why so far in the story we should be rooting for Jesus, who is just casually, for a snack, breaking Sabbath rule. If you were a good follower of God at this time, you would have seen that from Jesus as a ridiculous affront. So being a Christian 2,000 years later with a whole different set of series of indoctrinations that told you that Jesus was the good guy from the beginning, it's hilarious to me, because all I'm accused of is not being able to put myself in time and place and context and understand the realities of the Old Testament and what God had to do when he did things like condone slavery, etc. No, Christians are missing this. I just think it's so backwards. It's so hypocritical. It's almost too much. But let's do some more examples. Let's reverse it and have one where Jesus criticizes the Pharisees. Let me read to you from Matthew 15:10-20. Jesus called the crowd to him and said, "Listen and understand. What goes into someone's mouth does not defile them, but what comes out of their mouth, that is what defiles them." Then the disciples came to him and asked, "Do you know that the Pharisees were offended when they heard this?" He replied, "Every plant that my heavenly Father has not planted will be pulled up by the roots. Leave them. They are blind guides. If the blind lead the blind, both will fall into a pit." Peter said, "Explain the parable to us." "Are you still so dull?" Jesus asked them. "Don't you see that whatever enters the mouth goes into the stomach and then comes out of the body? But the things that come out of a person's mouth come from the heart, and these defile them." Okay, so once again, we have Jesus calling people to him just to tell them something completely opposite than what God the Father has told them. The Pharisees are just talking amongst themselves and being offended, as they should be. The disciples who hear this come back and tell Jesus, "Don't you know they were offended?" To which Jesus calls them blind guides, and that if the blind lead the blind, both will fall into a pit, which is a cheeky little quip, but it's also then exactly what has been happening in all of Yahweh's history thus far. How are the Pharisees blind for following the rules of God? Only by following the rules of God did you not fall into a pit. If anyone had behaved like Jesus is behaving now in the Old Testament, they'd be dead. And what I hear Christians try to negotiate with these kinds of texts is God's always been this way. God has always been like Jesus, and it's been man who has been messing things up, being too literal. No, God is the one who listed 613 very specific commandments, many of which 100% had to do with what you put in your mouth, not just what comes out of it. I'll encourage you to go read Leviticus 11 and Deut 14. In fact, let me just help you with a few of these. Here's some of the things you cannot put in your mouth. Camels, rabbits, pigs, sea creatures that lack fins and scales are prohibited. Birds that are considered unclean. Creatures that move on the ground, such as insects with certain kinds of legs. These are listed again in Deut 14, and then an emphasis on the prohibition of eating any detestable thing. A prohibition, a law, a do not. There's no spirit of the law here of this old God being some beautiful entity concerned more with what comes out of your mouth than what goes in. Again, I like Jesus's version better too. I'm with you, but it is 100% in open contradiction to what his supposed father commands, not commanded. Nothing has changed. And you can say, oh, well, that's what Jesus is here to do. That's what Jesus' death and resurrection does. First of all, the Pharisees don't know that Jesus is going to die and resurrect. He's another in a long chain of weirdos that was coming through with their own set of rules, acting like some kind of special figure or false prophet. This is the whole case I want to make. Not that any one group is right or any one religion is thus correct. Mainly that Jesus is in open defiance of God himself, not some beautiful, better expression of it. Another example, in John 8:3-11, you have an adulterous woman who is brought before Jesus, and they're saying, hey, law of Moses is clear. Look at Leviticus 20, verse 10. We need to stone her to death. And Jesus has his infamous reply, he who is without sin, go ahead and throw the first stone, which is a pretty badass remark. And again, I am all for it, as opposed to stoning women who have affairs. I do not think that is a proper execution of justice. But you know who did? God. That's why he gave the law in the first place. And by the way, there's a lot more dumb things you can be stoned to death for than having an affair, like being a disobedient child. Where was Jesus when all these laws were being given? Oh, according to Christians, he was right there at the same throne as the Father. Why didn't he protest then? Why didn't he give all of the women that were stoned to death in the Old Testament the grace of the spirit of the law? Maybe because the story is fictional, and we are now left with the remnants of two religions being crashed together, trying desperately to be made whole and cohesive when it's an impossibility. One of a few things happened here. God changed his mind and sent Jesus to show a new law, a new teaching. This is problematic more than any other option because God is then not immutable and there is no objective moral standard, which Christians love to remind me of. Or there are two gods, kind of a Marcion deal here, and God is evil and Jesus came to save us from him. Except there's a lot of holes with that because Jesus claims to be the Son of God. Or, and hear me out, none of it's true. And it's just a bunch of myths that got put up against one another and again are trying to be reconciled. If Occam's razor ever works, let us apply it here. So to end this section, I'll say again, I'm very pleased with the progression of Jesus over the Old Testament laws. I think he brought in some that are also highly problematic. I think he didn't address some of the worst ones. Would have been great here if Jesus could have lifted the status of women. Could have been great here if Jesus, who took as much time to defend his snacking actions in the fields of grain, did so against, I don't know, slavery or child abuse. But I'll state it one last time. My issue here is not for which version of which religion is the best suited to society today and that I would prefer. It is the obvious nature of how incompatible Jesus and Yahweh are, which immediately defeats the Christian faith in general. But let's move on to point 4, where we're going to be talking about why the Pharisees, in addition to Jesus openly breaking the rules, had no reason to extend an offer of grace to him because they believed him to be the Messianic king. Also, just saying it, why would the Messianic king be above the law? And I know the Christian answer because, again, I hear it on a weekly basis now that God can do whatever he wants, that God can be a hypocrite, that God doesn't have to follow his own rules. But do you see how confusing it really is if that's the case? God sends his son to be a perfect example for us, and Jesus, being the son, supposedly does a 180 on everything that God the Father had set forth for the last couple thousand years. Sure, I guess Jesus, if he is truly God or God's son or part of this Trinity, has the right to disobey these laws, but how confusing for us who are called to be Christ-like to know which ones to follow. Yes, we need to be Christ-like, but also love is to obey, and the greatest commandment, as Jesus tells us when questioned by the Pharisees, is to love the Lord your God. This puts us in a really tricky situation, which again has been answered. That doesn't mean it's been reconciled. The very fact that there are answers from Christians about Old Covenants and New Covenants, Jesus coming to break religion and create relation, and these things that are simply said, yes, they give an answer, but not the answer, not something that truly reconciles these issues. I'm not saying there's no apologetics for these things. Of course there are. There's 2,000 years of tradition going on here. That doesn't make it right any more than the last 1,300 years of tradition of Islam makes Allah real. Let's not lean on those things. Let's look at the reality here. And again, this isn't a fringe take. This is all of Judaism, by the way. I just so happen to also not believe in Judaism. So let's talk again. What was expected of the Messiah and what did Jesus do? Now, this is strange. There's two camps. You have all of these prophecies in the Old Testament about the Messianic king or figure that are simply not met by Jesus. There's 4 that are always listed, and I'll tell you them in a minute. But then you get all of these other prophecies that are clearly not meant to be about the Messiah. They don't state that at all. Isaiah 53 is the perfect example. You cannot reverse a Christian's mind on this. They read Isaiah 53 in light of what the Gospels have tried to tie back to it, and all they can see is Jesus' crucifixion. But that was never supposed to be about Jesus. That was never even supposed to be about the Messiah. Same thing with the virgin birth. Not only do we get that it was supposed to be a young woman and not a virgin, but Matthew, only utilizing the Septuagint, didn't understand that the mistranslation in the Septuagint that said virgin actually was supposed to mean young woman. So when he made the virgin narrative, he did so incorrectly to try to fulfill prophecy backwards, which we saw with a ton of other issues in Matthew. But again, these examples, Isaiah 53 or the virgin example from Isaiah 7, they're not about a future Messiah. They're about something imminent in that generation. So again, those are 2 examples of many where New Testament writers are actively, after it is clear that Jesus died and did not do what was expected of the actual Messianic king to do, we're trying to tie him back into Scripture still. So those are the 2 things. scripture that's actually about the Messiah that Jesus doesn't fulfill, scripture that's not about the Messiah that New Testament writers take and place onto Jesus's life. I covered many of these examples in my Matthew video. So what are the four that most people point to of what is expected of the actual Messiah? Well, the first one is the building of the temple, and this comes from Ezekiel 37:26 through 28. Some call it the rebuilding of the temple in general or the third temple. Either way, the Messiah figure is supposed to build the temple that will last forever. Now, Christians say, just because the temple was around when Jesus was here and got destroyed after his death, and he hasn't come to do anything about it, we've got the second coming. Second coming is not in the Old Testament. All of the things that were expected of the Messiah were things that this natural human, not deity, would actually do in the first go, in the only life he would have on this earth. This is the definition of moving the goalpost, and you're going to see it with all four of these, by the way. This is what cults do. They make prophecies, they don't come true, and they move the goalpost. 100% crystal clear in the Old Testament, in Ezekiel, this coming messianic figure was going to build and maintain the temple forever. The second one comes from Isaiah 43:5-6, where we know that this messianic figure will gather all of the Jews back to the land of Israel and be king of all of them. This did not happen in Jesus' time. It has not happened in the 2,000 years since. So again, it has been moved to something that Jesus will do when he comes back, which Jesus said in Matthew 24:34 he would do before this generation dies out, which was about 80 generations ago, by the way. 3 is utopia, that he would usher in a time of everlasting peace, the end of all hatred and oppression and war. There's many verses that point to this, but Isaiah 2:4 is pretty clear. I hate to break it to you, that did not happen when Jesus was here, and it has not happened since, especially considering Israel is currently at war as we speak. And then number 4, and we get this again in many places, but Zechariah 14:9 is very clear that all will have the correct understanding. We see this in many cases in the Old Testament being prophesied, where finally all nations will recognize God as the one true God, that there will be this universal knowledge of the divine, and that furthermore, it will unite humanity as one, going back to point 3. And yet, we still have many world religions, and not just the ones from when Jesus was around, which many are still going strong, but even new ones since then. It is the opposite of condensing down to one. There are more Muslims today that believe in Allah than there were even people on the earth when Jesus was alive. Swing and a miss. Again, there's more than just these 4, but these are pretty hard and fast-baked rules about the Messiah, the future king, and what he would do. That doesn't get into all of the characteristics that were actually expected of this king, or some of the things that are tried to be fulfilled through the Gospels. He's supposed to come from the line of David, which gets passed down in Jewish rite by man, not woman, but yet he's born of a virgin. That screws that up, doesn't it? Well, his adopted father is still Joseph, so it works out because we can also trace Joseph's lineage conveniently back to David. So that's an example of kind of a messy one, and yeah, you can make an argument or a case for it, and yeah, it's even represented in the Gospel as trying to account for it, but these other 4, it just didn't happen. Imagine too, in the context, which is always so important to Christians, any time that there was a king that came and helped redeem the people. What did that look like when you got a new prophet or a new king and things got back on track and they got out of God's punishment and into God's rewards? It happened by strictly adhering again to the law, which they hadn't been previously, which Jesus doesn't seem to care about at all, and military conquest, which Jesus may have very well cared about, but got himself arrested and killed before he could do anything about. So again, even contextually speaking, Jesus didn't look like what he was supposed to. And that's again where the Christians are going to say, that's what's so beautiful about it. He was establishing a spiritual kingdom. He didn't have to rebuild the temple. He was the temple. It was never going to be about getting it all done on earth. It was about the kingdom of heaven, and on and on and on, with excuse after excuse after excuse that is just completely a night and day difference from what we see in the Old Testament. The purpose of this video is clearly not to say Pharisees are perfect people, they were right all along, we should have a religion dedicated to them and not to Jesus. Nope, obviously nothing like that. They were people. I'm sure they were elitist. I'm sure they abused their power like many religious leaders do, but they were at least philosophically, religiously, and scripturally consistent. And Jesus was not. And again, I'm glad he's not, but that makes it awfully hard to make the case that he is one of the same with this God of the Old Testament, with Yahweh, with the rule maker of those original 613 rules, with the entity that physically killed or had his people do the killing killing of people who broke these laws, who didn't care to understand the spirit of the law, who didn't care to preach turn the other cheek, but instead laid down a eye for an eye retaliation method. It's not congruent, it's not consistent, it's not cohesive. You cannot make this work. Some of the gospel writers tried, they obviously failed. See Matthew and stay tuned for Mark, Luke, and John, let alone what we hear from some of the Gnostic texts. That's my case for today. I hope you enjoyed it. I have a feeling of what kind of comments I will get from certain kinds of believers, but I am curious to hear the rest of everyone's thoughts, any questions or objections that you want to point out. Happy Sunday. Thanks so much for being here. I'll see you on Tuesday with another takedown. And until then, keep thinking. I wanted to personally thank my top tiers of support, my Iconoclast and Boris GVI, Jacob, Joe, Martin, Oliver, Perry, Rokkit, and Shawn, my Humanist heroes, Jarrod, James, and Kristi, my Atheist advocates, Caleb, Imposter, Jeff, Jeffrey, Karen, Sparky, and Todd, as well as all of my secular scholar patrons. If you believe in the mission of the channel or you just enjoy the content, please consider joining these fine people. Thanks and have a great day.